Welcome to the Water Channel podcast, a series of conversations on water, food and agriculture. We feature stories and insights that are defining our present and are shaping our future. I am Abraham Abhishek. The Nile is one of the most recognized rivers the world over. No matter where you grew up, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Europe, Canada, Bolivia, chances are you have heard of it. You probably read about it in school. The Nile is a transboundary river. Part of it originates in Ethiopia, the other part in Lake Victoria, which is shared between Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania. These two branches meet in Sudan and then run down to Egypt. Together, the whole river system also runs through or along the borders of Congo, Burundi, Rwanda and South Sudan. But it is very likely that the image you associate most strongly with the river are the pyramids, and the country you associate most strongly with it is Egypt. Now, there are many reasons why this is so, why there is this downstream mentality. Some of those reasons have led to water sharing disputes between the different riparian countries, which over the years have assumed many shapes, forms and dimensions. But the Nile is not just a natural resource that countries fight over. It is a river, a major, huge river that is a key source of water and food to communities all along its course. In fact, a big part of it runs through areas so dry that there would not have been any habitation there if it was not for the Nile itself. What this also means is that the Nile is a big shaper of the culture, customs, and outlook for hundreds of millions of people. Today, we are lucky to have on our podcast Emanuele Fantini from IHE-Delft Institute of Water Education in the Netherlands. For nearly 6 years now, he has shaped and steered a project called Media, Science and Diplomacy in the Nile Basin. The project studies the role of science and media in shaping the narrative around this contentious transboundary river, and what kind of effect that has on conflicts, disputes, and diplomacy that surround it. The project has also gone on to document and share everyday life around the Nile, the kind of relationships regular people have with the river in their daily lives. Emanuele, thanks a lot for talking to us. You've been working on this project for almost 6 years. In course of it, you must have met, interacted with, worked with people from different Nile riparian countries. It is a very difficult task, a very difficult question to answer, but could you give us a snapshot of the different things that the Nile means to different people along its course?
To be honest with you, no, I cannot. As you said, it's perhaps a too difficult question, and also I think it would not pay justice to the variety and the plurality of meanings, uses and practices that people associate to the river. Not to forget that the river is not only for humans, but it's a natural ecosystem, so there are also animals, other living creatures that depend on the Nile, that live on the Nile. So what I can tell you and what I've learned is, for instance, that even the river itself is named as different name. In Ethiopia, the Blue Nile is called Abai. The Ethiopian, when they look at the Nile River, in my opinion, what they see nowadays is a dam. It's not even a river. They see the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, because that's what is visualized in public spaces in Ethiopia. So it's not even the water, it's just the infrastructure. And of course, I think in Egypt, maybe people think about the delta, agriculture, or think about water for their domestic consumption, because they depend on the Nile River for almost all kind of water uses and supply.
The Nile itself, it is not the longest river in the world. It is not the river that carries the most amount of water. It is also not the most significant river commercially, or the river system that sustains the largest number of people. But still, when we talk about transboundary rivers, transboundary waters, and all the connotations that come with it, conflict, cooperation, etc., the Nile is the first river that comes to mind. Is that just me, or is that a more widely held impression? And if yes, why do you think that is? Why is the Nile so representative as a transboundary water resource?
Yeah, I don't think it's only you. Definitely it is me as well. I'll give you a coffee mug quote from an historian, a Norwegian historian, who's also been fascinating by the Nile River. His name is Terje Tvedt. And I remember that when I was interviewing him for the podcast that we did, The Sources of the Nile, he said that the Nile is African water, but a world river. And I think the reason why the Nile is so iconic when it comes to transboundary international rivers is because indeed it's part of the imaginary, of the culture, not only of the people who live on the banks of the river, but of a broader, I would say, a global community. I can think of myself, I'm Italian, I was raised in Italy, I went to primary school in Italy, and I remember my first lessons in history. Okay, you have pre-history, but then when you start to study the great civilization, at least in Italy, and I guess in Europe is more or less that, we all begin with ancient Egypt. And what you learn is about the Nile and how it was fertilizing the soil and how the river sustained such an important civilization. So I think the symbolic cultural meaning of the Nile is perhaps something unique. We were discussing earlier about tourism. I think modern tourism was also born on the along the Nile River with the first cruises. So again, something which belongs to not only to the people who live in the basin, but to a global community.
Looking at the Nile as a transboundary river and thinking about all the disputes that surround it, here's a simplistic take on what the nature of that dispute essentially is. For the longest time, Egypt and perhaps Sudan got the lion's share of the water rights, the rights to use the Nile waters. And this was largely because there was a power differential between Egypt and Sudan on the one hand, and everyone else on the other. And now that the other riparian countries are gaining power, they are gaining influence, they're kind of flexing their muscles, they're asserting their own claims on the Nile River, on the Nile waters. And that is essentially what the dispute around the Nile waters is at the moment. So that's the take. What are the holes? What are the gaps? What are the inconsistencies with respect to facts in this particular view?
No, I think that's a fair representation of what is going on in the Nile Basin. Of course, one issue is, think about Sudan, for instance. Is it an upstream or a downstream country? Of course, it's a downstream in relation to Ethiopia, but for Egypt, it's an upstream country. And indeed, this is one of the issues when it comes to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. For instance, the main concern by Egypt is, of course, the dam that Ethiopia is building. But one of the main concerns is how that dam will allow Sudan to irrigate the plains that are and use Nile water to irrigate the plants. So beside Egypt and countries like Ethiopia or Rwanda, Burundi, who are at the sources of the Nile, all the other countries are always downstream of someone, of another country, and upstream. So, but I think it's fair. So beside that, those cases, I think that's a fair representation, and indeed, it's what has been going on in the past years inside the Nile Basin Initiative, which is the main intergovernmental platform for both technical and political cooperations among the Nile countries. So indeed, there is this new comprehensive framework agreement, which has been ratified mostly by upstream countries because the new agreement redefines indeed the rights of the users of the river. And as you say, the Nile River was before that agreement, which, by the way, has not been ratified by Egypt and Sudan exactly because of this reason, because it shifted what used to be called the colonial order, which was somehow crafted under the British colonial rule, during which the Nile was essentially managed thinking about the cotton plantations of the British in Sudan and of course in Egypt. So there was this, let's call it, downstream mentality. All the waters need to be channeled there, which of course was challenged by the new framework crafted under the Nile Basin initiative.
Mm-hmm. Would it be right to say that the current discourse around the Nile is centered around, has its fulcrum resting upon the GERD or the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam? Is that correct? And going ahead, given what the current situation is, given the positionality of the different parties, what do you think is an amicable solution to this? You have 30 seconds to provide a definitive solution to this very important and very complex geopolitical issue.
So what we learned by studying the role of media and science communication in conflicts and cooperation along the Nile River, and of course in particular around the issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, are, I would say, two things. The first is that technically a solution, an agreement on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not that difficult to reach. It's a matter of agreeing on how, for instance, to measure what we mean by drought, and therefore agree on certain level in terms of filling the basin of the dam, or water that has to flow downstream depending on the climate and on the evolution of the climate. So, and of course then it's also an issue of operating the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in a collaborative way, in a coordinated way with the other dams that are downstreams in Sudan or in Egypt, up to the High Aswan Dam. So I think what we learn, especially from technical people, is that a solution to that problem, of course, it requires negotiation, but can be reached. The problem is that the dam and the river are loaded, as we discussed earlier, with political meanings, with symbolism, which is also associated to either political project or national identities, that make it very hard and difficult to negotiate. Because of course we can maybe negotiate the shares of water among the two of us, but negotiating your own identity or your own political vision and aspiration, it's much more difficult. And it's much more difficult also to agree and find a common ground. So that's why I think understanding this is, of course, the first thing, to really learn how other people think and think about the river, which are their dreams, aspiration, cultural meanings that they associate to the river. Because without that understanding, it would be even impossible to start the negotiation on this more political, cultural, identitarian dimension of the river or of its infrastructure, like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And the name itself already tells a lot. How can you negotiate your Renaissance? It's very hard, but it should be done.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation the Nile Basin Initiative. What has been its role, not only in the context of the most current ongoing disputes, but in general over its lifetime? What has been its role, and how effective or ineffective has it been in fostering cooperation among the different riparian countries?
We've been working with the Nile Basin initiatives, particularly given the scope of our project. We've been working with them on training journalists, in promoting communication and exchange between journalists and scientists. I see two added value of the NBI. The first one is indeed thinking and promoting a basin-wide approach, view, and you have also many spillover of this basin-wide approach. You can think of InfoNile as a media house, or The Niles, another magazine which is also made by journalists from an editorial team of journalists coming from different Nile Basin countries, or the Nile Basin Discourse, a sort of civil society partner of the NBI. So I think this basin-wide approach is there. Of course, it's still a view, a perspective of people who are already familiar, who are already working maybe on water on the Nile, water management, manager, water expert, researchers, journalists. But the other important leg is, I think, the technical cooperation also, not at sub-basin level. So there are ongoing projects involving not all the countries of the basin, but maybe at sub-basin level, so among different countries. And I think this is another important role, because if you, of course, it's one basin, but on the other side, it can be difficult to make it tangible for someone in Egypt or in Rwanda that they share the same water. I think it's easier for someone in Uganda to collaborate or to have some joint project with neighboring countries, right? And so maybe the sub-basin scale, when it comes to implementing projects, irrigation, hydropower, is the most effective and relevant one, because that's the scale at which you can indeed physically, materially understand that we are sharing a river.
Interesting. Moving on to international law and the concept itself of international law. And of course, I don't have a background in international law. I was just reflecting upon the term. From the point of view of a common person, law is law. It is a rule which is part of the ground rules of the society or whichever entity we are talking about. With regards to the Nile as a transboundary resource, we have all these international conventions and treaties which sort of make for what we call international law. There is the Helsinki Rules, the European Water Convention, the United Nations Water Convention, the Berlin Water Resources Rules, and there are probably many more which I do not know about. So essentially all these things invoke among the riparian countries the duty to cooperate over shared water resources. At the same time, nations are sovereign entities. They do not have obligations. They don't have a compulsion to follow international law. So one can say that international law is not enforceable. So given that, how important are international laws? And you can think of specific ones in the Nile context. How important are they, despite the fact that they are not enforceable? What do they bring to the table, if not crime and punishment?
I'm not a lawyer, so I will give you an answer from a political scientist perspective on this. First of all, I think that if I think of the Nile, international law, it's important and it's good as it sets principles, and which is already something important. There are principles that are universally acknowledged and agreed upon, to which governments subscribe. So then the problem is, even before enforcing, how you move from how you translate those general principles into norms or framework for sharing waters. What does it mean, the principle of equitable share, or the principle of not significant harm that should not be caused to the downstream? So all these principles are indeed important, because they are the basis of our agreement. But the challenge starts even before enforcing them, on agreeing, okay, how do we translate those principles into practice? And then if I think about the Nile, the other challenge is indeed, which are the body, the agreement, the framework that should enforce or address a dispute. And at the moment, that's the main issue when it comes to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, because the Egyptian government, the Sudanese government, they would like to have a legally binding treaty with a sovereign national authority that can enforce it in terms of deciding and operating the dams, while Ethiopia refused that. And they said, we will deal with ad hoc bodies if a dispute arises. So there is first the issue of translation of principle into policies, norms, and framework for water management, water sharing, and then there is indeed the issue of which is the body, the authority that can enforce. And let me make a final point on sovereignty. So if I think about the Nile River, maybe it's not a lesson. I wouldn't call it a lesson, but an experience that can be shared. For me, is the experience of the European Union, which was born after the Second World War as European Economic Commission. This was one leg, and then there was the leg of the European Commission on the coal and steel. So what the European countries did, they, after the Second World War, they accepted to give up to their sovereignty on the coal and the steel, the two main resources that had been used for war. And by giving up sovereignty on those two resources, they started to build what is today. That was the first step to build what today is the European Union. And those were countries that just fought each other. Germany and France, the Netherlands and Germany, Italy, England, they were at war. So would it be possible to give up national sovereignty on the Nile River and to let the river and its dam infrastructure that needs to be operated in a coordinated manner, in a cooperative way at the supranational level, maybe at the basin level?
You are a political scientist, you are from the academia, and you look for nuance. So I would like to ask you about something which I don't think is a very nuanced idea, which is bandied around quite a lot, and that is water wars. It is a nice alliteration. Both words start with a W, so it's very catchy, sounds very catchy. And central to the concept of water wars is that they're imminent. I've been hearing for a very long time that the next war is going to be on water. So this has not quite happened. I come from India and we fight with our neighbors Pakistan over all sorts of things, over the stupidest of things. But there has never been any significant conflict around the sharing of the numerous transboundary rivers that we share, such as the Indus. So, given this, how imminent do you think are water wars? When are they going to take place? Please give us a date.
A date. I agree with you that water wars is indeed something that goes very well on media headlines not only because of the alliteration, war, but also because if you think about it, put together two terms which are sharply in contrast. War, which is about death, and water, which is about life. So that's why I think it, especially editors, find it a catchy idea, because it's something that can indeed attract and elicit strong emotion and feelings. On the other side, as you said, it's also pretty inaccurate, because maybe the real news is that in spite of having been announced in the past 30 years, because I remember Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the UN, saying in the next century, the wars will be fought over water instead of oil. So the real news is that water wars have not happened. Some people might say yet. But if we look at what is going on in Ukraine or to stay in the Nile Basin in Ethiopia, there is unfortunately a civil war, or the war in Ukraine. I don't think the reason is water, but it's political. It's a political reason. The civil war in Ethiopia has political reasons behind. There is a conflict between political elites. There is an identity component in terms of struggle and conflict between different nationalities. And of course, then water comes into the picture, but not as a source of conflict. I would say as a collateral, as a victim of the conflict. So maybe the wars are not fought for water, but I would say the wars most of the time are fought against water, against life, against, for instance, the farmer that in Ethiopia could not plow, could not farm their fields, and as a consequence of the war, now they're starving. But so water is a collateral, is a victim of the war, is never a source of war, at least in my view.
Interesting. Talking about convenient catchphrases and how the media amplifies them, this is perhaps a good point in the conversation to talk about your project that you have been helming, you have been managing and shaping for the past 6 years or so. And as I understand, it is a lot about science. It is a lot about media in the context of the transboundary river, which is the Nile. So if you could give us some broad brushstrokes of the project, how has the project aimed to, over the years, how has it aimed to improve the understanding of citizens, of policymakers, whoever the stakeholders are, around the Nile River or around the Nile Basin in general?
Yes, so what we did in our project called Open Water Diplomacy, with the idea of opening up this field of water diplomacy that might be perceived a bit as closed, as secret, as diplomacy happened behind the curtain. So we wanted to explore its public dimension by looking at the public dimension of water diplomacy by looking in particular at the role of media and science communication. We have been working with journalists and researchers from different Nile Basin countries to do mostly three things. First, to study the role of media and science communication in water conflict and cooperation along the Nile River, because there were no previous studies and analysis trying to understand, okay, how do the media talk, represent, and picture the Nile River. Second, we provided some trainings. Initially, we thought, okay, let's train journalists on water issues and scientists on media and communication skills. But then we realized later that it was, of course, we did, and we started with those type of training, but then we realized that what was particularly interesting was also to bring them together and give, so to let them know each other, interact with each other, and also get joint training. And third, what we did by bringing journalists and researchers together, we supported them in co-producing, in producing together communication outputs. We did podcasts. We give support to the birth of InfoNile, a geojournalist platform, which now it's walking on its own legs thanks to Africa Water Journalist. We published a handbook on media in water conflict and cooperation, targeting journalists. We did a photojournalist project called Everyday Nile, which in using and mobilizing the power of photos to tell story and to elicit emotions. What we mostly learned from the research is that the research was done by a multinational and multidisciplinary teams of researchers coming from Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Italy, because when myself and a colleague from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, WITS, his name is Eugenio Gagliardone. So what we discovered was that one of the main findings and conclusion is that when it comes to mainstream media, and we did analysis of media in Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and global media like Al Jazeera or The Guardian, the analysis, the narratives are caught in what we call the nation trap. It's still the idea that when it comes to the Nile River, there are those states which are homogeneous entity, each one has its own national interest, and we always see Ethiopia against Egypt, or Sudan and Egypt against, or trying to collaborate. So, but the nation state as the main central unit. There is very little question and debate on how, for instance, the Nile River, the water of the Nile River, is distributed inside, within those countries. How this national interest is formed, is created. So this is, for instance, and then what we tried to do was to try to break or get out of this, of such nation trap, by promoting transboundary or transdisciplinary collaborations between journalists and researchers. And of course, what we learn is that you can do that at the margins, not at the center of the stage. First, because maybe it's a niche topic, but also because we haven't mentioned it yet, but when it comes to media, science communication, research in the Nile Basin, which is a highly politicized and securitized river, the big elephant in the room is, of course, freedom of expression, freedom of research. And that's why, for instance, our journalist colleagues from Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt were asking us, please, let's not use this water war frame, because as soon as the river is translated or framed as an issue of security, national security, then our freedom of expression, our margin of maneuver shrunk. And there are immediately red lines that we cannot overcome, that we cannot pass. And it becomes very difficult to get access to data, to get people, to get interviews. People don't want to risk. They don't feel safe. So what we did is to try to break this nation trap by working at the margins. And for instance, this Everyday Nile is an example. Those are photo stories collected by photojournalists from in different Nile Basin countries. They are telling stories, as the title of the activity of the project say, like everyday stories. Everyday stories of daily interaction, daily use of the river, its water, by people, can be farmer, fishermen. But I think, and of course, it's not the big contested controversy like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, but by working at the margins, I think you can find spaces to explore, to experiment, to try to promote new narratives, and also to create connections. I think by looking at everyday Nile interaction with the river, perhaps people can also can find connection between an Egyptian farmer and an Ethiopian farmer, between a fisherman in Lake Victoria in Uganda and a fisherman in a lake in South Sudan. Why not? So this is the type of, this is the other conclusion that we've reached and that we've also trying to implement, to transform the narratives by working at the margins. And by transforming the narratives, trying to transform the conflict and the way people perceive it.
Picking up on the term nation trap, when you put journalists from, for lack of a better term, opposing countries, so like journalists from Ethiopia and Egypt, for example, when you put them together in the same room, what was their behavior towards each other? And what were they most curious to know about each other, to know from each other?
That's a very important question, because indeed what I also learned by working with journalists and also researchers, because we had not only people in the same room from different countries, but also from different professions. So what I learned is that by creating personal relations, bonds, you can also develop collaborative work and project. And I think people also, by learning about other experience, other ideas about the river, about the Nile, they get reinforced. And I think for them it's also an opportunity to clarify their identity, their role, their contribution. One example, for instance, is the artistic coordinator of Everyday Nile, who was able, is from Egypt, Roger Anis. He was able to travel to Ethiopia at the sources of the Nile in Lake Tana. And for him was the first time in Ethiopia, was also the first time to see the Nile in Ethiopia and to see how people fetch water. And in Egypt, he had this idea of Ethiopia as an abundant, as a country where, especially on the highland, where water is abundant. But for him was striking, was a discovery to see that still people, in spite of having water there, they have to walk a long route to fetch water and to carry water in their home. So, so we had this kind of discovery. We also had a kind of clarification on our own role, contribution, and also responsibility. For instance, as a researcher, how do we act? How do we, when we are interviewed by a journalist, what type of, what idea of science do we want to convey? Do we have the solution? Do we point at problems? Do we believe science as something which is, let's say, like the God eye that see the problem from above, from a neutral position? Or are we also part of the problem, part of the conflict? So those type of conversation that unfolded, which I would qualify as a dialogic conversation. That's a metaphor that I learned from another project on the Nile called the Nile Project. There was a band of musicians getting together from different Nile Basin countries, getting together to use music to raise curiosity about the Nile River. And its founder, Mina Girgis, an ethnomusicologist also from Egypt, told me that in describing the process, he was telling me that when musicians get together, first of all, they had to get to know each other, because you have different musical scales, different instruments in the different countries, maybe different tones that don't exist in other cultures. So you need to find a way to get along, to play together. And when you play together with musicians from other countries, what they did was not to create a super identity, a Nile identity, but each of the musician was somehow confirming, reinforce in their own identity, and at the same time found a way to get along, to play, to enter in a conversation with, or in this case, in a play, in a music play with other musicians. And that's what is called dialogic conversation, different from the dialectic that we tend to see and reproduce in the media. And indeed, there was also something that inspired us in our project to create spaces for such dialogic conversation, where you don't necessarily reach an agreement, but at least you learn, you discover other perspectives, and you also clarify your own.
If you would like to explore what came out of those dialogical conversations and other activities in the project, a good place to start is the website infonile.org. You will find there stories done by journalists, data and insights produced through collaborations between scientists working across borders, training material on science communication around the Nile, and much more. Thanks for your time, Emanuele.
Thanks to you. It was fun to be on the other side of the mic, because usually I'm the one asking questions. So